Okay, everybody, welcome to day 4, session 3. My name is Oliver Pierce. I'm the Director of Commercialization at Montreal. Thank you so much for everybody for joining. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to fall in. I see a lot of people joining. Let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from, what city, what country, and we'll get started very, very shortly. Got a really great session planned for this slot. We're going to be focusing on standardization of eTMF and looking into industry to see what parallels we can draw with potentially other models for standardization. So got a really good session planned. Again, I'm just going to let everybody fall in. Seems to be a lot of you still joining. Welcome. I'm going to add my my speaker. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Oliver.
So obviously today's presentation will be led by Paul Fenton, who's Montreal's president and CEO. And many of you, if you've attended any Montreal events in the past or any industry events for that matter, will have likely heard from Paul before. We will give everybody, as I said, a few minutes to join. So we've got people joining here from Mumbai, India, New York, Toronto, and we've got, I see Robin here from Australia. So there's a whole bunch of you for dialing in. I still find it impressive, Paul, those that are dialing in from APAC and the oceanic region. I mean, that's impressive. No, that's commitment to TMF learning.
Absolutely. It's the middle of the night, I believe, in Australia. So.
I think so, yeah.
And it's the winter, which makes it even more difficult, right? It's kind of those dark nights. But yeah, it's great to see a wide variety of people from lots of different places.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got Fran's here. Hey, Fran. Thanks for joining us again. From California, we've got Yogi from Ottawa. Hey, Yogi. San Diego, UK, Indiana. Lots of different places here. Kolkata, India. Amazing. All right. So as you guys are all falling in and introducing yourselves to each other, I will kick off my part of today's presentation. So my role is the least important role in today's presentation. I'm the MC of the session, but we're obviously joined, as I mentioned, by Paul Fenton. We're going to be covering a really interesting topic, and one that, of course, Paul is very well positioned to talk about based on his experience and involvement with industry as it relates to standardization. And we're going to be focusing on what are some of the parallels that can be drawn from the various different standards that may be available today. Just some housekeeping for everybody. Please use the Q&A box. Lots of the sessions today have been very, very active with the questions. I see a few of those that have been involved in sessions earlier today, so keep those questions coming. We will be taking questions for a full 15 minutes at the end of Paul's presentation, where we'll be throwing some difficult questions at Paul and hoping that he can answer them. All of these sessions will be recorded. If you want to look at any of the previous sessions from TMF Week, you can always go back to the agenda and you can check out the recording as well as the slide deck, the PDF of the actual slide deck itself. So if you really want to take some of that content back, maybe you want to share that with internal team members, you can do that. As I mentioned before in other sessions, all attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for the entire TMF Week conference. So you'll get that a couple of weeks after the conference. You can submit that to your training record. You can add it to your LinkedIn profile. After every session, there is a networking break. Paul will actually be a part of that networking break following this. So if you want to have a one-on-one conversation or a one-to-many conversation with Paul and others around this subject, you can join the networking session that's right after this. We're going to take 15 minutes and spend some time in the lounge. And then, of course, please head over to the exhibit hall. You'll see all of the organizations that have been a part of putting TMF Week together, members of our advisory board and so on. So please visit the booth, learn a little bit more about their organization and so on. So with that, what I'll do is introduce today's speaker. So we have Paul Fenton, who is President and CEO of Montreal. And as President and CEO, Paul, obviously leading the organization and has significant industry experience at a senior management level. not only in the development and deployment of computerized systems, but also in the management of these systems for use in regulated clinical trials. Paul actually co-founded Montrum in 2005. Obviously, as a technology company, has a strong background in CDISC and ICH standards, as well as in the integration of systems and processes for clinical trials. Paul is, of course, the co-chair of the eTMF Exchange Mechanism Standard Initiative as part of the TMF reference model, as well as sitting on the TMF reference model steering committee and leadership team. And as Fran mentioned, Paul is one of those individuals that TMF Week could not happen without, and I would agree with that. So with that, I will remove myself from stream, and Paul, I will allow you to begin sharing your screen.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Fran, for the comment, for the compliment. Very much appreciated. All right, so I am now going to share my screen. Oliver, if you can just confirm to me that you can see the slides.
Absolutely, yep, we can see.
Great. All right, so once again, welcome everybody. I hope this talk will be informative and sort of get you thinking a little bit about the importance of standardization when it comes to computerized systems in general, and also in terms of clinical trial information. So what we're going to talk about is, first of all, we'll talk a little bit about what is a standard and why are they important. We'll then look at some of the other standards that we use currently today in the clinical trial arena. And then I have a few sort of reflections on the reference model, so the TMF reference model, because obviously we're talking about TMF, and whether it is a standard or not. I know that a lot of people sort of ask themselves that question. And then we'll talk about sort of benefits of becoming a formal standard, and then finally, you know, how the future of eTMF will sort of, I imagine, sort of take us down that road of standardization as we start to use more and more technology. So a disclaimer, what I'm presenting today really is my own personal views and opinions. It really isn't the representative of the views of the TMF reference model itself or any other organization for that matter. So this is really just my personal opinions and views in terms of standardization. So what is a standard? So I did a bit of research because I think that we all have a sort of an idea of what a standard is, but you know, it can be different depending on how you see things. And so what I did is I looked at the BSI website, so the British Standards Institute, which is a pretty big standards organization, which is actually international, even though it's British. And they had a pretty nice definition on their website, which I thought I'd share with you guys. So they described a standard as being an agreed way of doing something. They also described it as the distilled wisdom of people with expertise in their subject matter. They also said that a standard is knowledge that really makes our everyday lives easier, and it's something that provides a reliable basis for people to share the same expectations about a product or service. So all of those things seem pretty straightforward, and we're gonna sort of keep those in mind as we go through this discussion on standardization and how it's being used today in our industry and how it could be used potentially in the future for trial master file. So when we think about standards, standards actually evolve. They evolve kind of naturally, and there are different stages of evolution. There are two sort of key factors when we think about standards. There's adoption, so are people using it? And then there's formality, so how formal is this standard? And so when it comes to formality, there's informal and formal. And the way that I define informal here is really not governed by a standards body. So it's really just a group of people that have got together and decided, okay, this is how we want to do something. Now, when you have sort of low formality and low adoption, and typically it's not really a standard, it's a common practice, it's a common way of doing things, but it can be quite variable. And an example in our industry of this is a monitoring visit report. So everybody produces monitoring visit reports, and you typically have a checklist of different things that you need to check off, or say initiation visits or closeout visits. And then there's a whole bunch of other information that you collect in those monitoring reports. And there's kind of a common agreement across the industry as to what is typically held within those reports. Now, as adoption of that sort of commonly agreed set of things increases, we start to go more towards what we call a de facto standard. So a de facto standard is something that's highly adopted in industry. A lot of people are using it, but it's not yet formal. It's not yet governed by a standards body. And this is where I think the TMF reference model is today. It's a de facto standard. Now, standards after that can go two different ways. They can either become obsolete. So if you think about, I was trying to think of an example in our industry of an obsolete standard, but I thought it was better to choose something which was easier to grasp. And so the 3.5-inch floppy disk, you remember those things about 20, 30 years ago? They were the big deal, right? We were actually able to store data on a floppy disk and then give it to somebody and they could load it into their computer. Well, that today is pretty much obsolete. So it's an obsolete standard. It's been replaced by something better. A de facto standard can also go another way. It can become what we call a de jure standard. And de jure standards, it's basically something that's been formally recognized and being managed by a standards body. So an example of this is ISO 9001 quality systems. So this is something that's governed by ISO, an international standards body, and is recognized internationally. Now, the final step for a standard, and not all of them go this way, is that it could be legally required. And so it could be a regulatory authority that legally requires you to use a particular standard. And in our industry, a good example of that is eCTD for regulatory submissions, which have now become legally required by FDA, by Health Canada, by EMA. So we have to use this standard when we're doing submissions to regulatory authorities. So this is kind of the journey that standards typically go through. Now, why are standards important to our industry? If we think about what we do, clinical research tends to be very data intensive. There's a lot of information that we collect during a clinical trial. We also are experiencing more and more decentralization of clinical trials. There's more and more organizations involved. We're doing a lot more outsourcing of clinical trials, and we're also using a lot more systems in clinical trials. And so all of that information is really also becoming decentralized. And so it's really important that we have a really good way of being able to exchange that information between all of these organizations. We're also seeing that data is gradually replacing documents. And this is specifically within the context of TMF. So as time goes on, I think we'll see more and more of this. So if you think about a TMF, a lot of it is forms or emails. And I think that we'll start to sort of change the way that we collect this information in the future. The scope of inspections is also broadening. So inspectors are wanting to look at a lot more information when it comes to looking at trial master files. And they're also looking at other systems. And so having standards to easily provide that information is important. Costs are rising. So when you look at the average cost of developing a drug nowadays, I think it's at 1.2 billion. And it keeps on going up every year. And so we need to be more efficient and try and sort of maintain those costs. Scrutiny is also increasing. So the regulators are delving much deeper now into our information, and they also expect to have good oversight, and there needs to be traceability. And so all of this requires us to be able to easily exchange and provide information around traceability and also demonstrate oversight. And all of these things, I think standards can help with. So when I was looking at standardization, I was looking at what's already out there, what's already being used. And this slide sort of highlights the different types of systems that we use within clinical trials. So we have obviously all of the clinical data collection and analysis systems that we typically see. You know, the most common ones are probably IRT and EDC, but there's a whole bunch of other systems as well. And what we see is there's already a lot of standardization around this group of systems. And when it comes to the other side of the house, the clinical process management systems, so things like eTMF or quality management or CTMS, we do have some standards, notably around regulatory information, but it's a lot poorer than on the clinical data side of things. When we look at clinical data, we have things like DICOM, which is for medical images, which is a standard we use to be able to evaluate those medical images and store them, as well as all of the evaluation data. We have CDISC, which has been around now for quite a few years and has developed a series of standards which kind of range from preclinical data right the way through to data analysis. And it's pretty comprehensive, and they work very closely, obviously, with Transcelerate, which is an industry organization which is also focused somewhat on establishing standards. We have ICH, who play an important role in standards, especially around pharmacovigilance. So there's the E2VM standard, which we use for submitting safety information to the regulators. And then finally, there's also HL7 that some of you may have heard of, which is more of a healthcare type standard. So it's health level 7. But this standard we use a lot in electronic medical records. And there's, of course, interest in trying to be able to integrate with that standard to facilitate the exchange of medical information to things like EDC. And there are other standards as well, but these are the primary ones that came to mind when I was thinking about, you know, what do we use today on the clinical side of things. On the process management side of things, within eTMF, we do have a standard called the Exchange Mechanism Standard, although it's not a formal standard today. When it comes to quality management, we don't really have standards other than things like ISO, which are very general. They're not specific to our industry. Although in medical devices, we do have a specific ISO standard for quality management. Regulatory information, as I said, is really where we do have formal standards. So we have ECCD, and then we also have IDMP, and there are some others, which are all governed by ICH. And then finally, CTMS, again, we don't really have a formal industry standard for CTMS information. So that's kind of paints a picture. Now, I was thinking about, well, what have these standards achieved? You know, what have we got from these standards as an industry? And the first thing that we have is the, you know, obviously the standardization of information that we're transferring to the regulatory authorities with eCTD and STTM for clinical data sets and E2BM for pharmacovigilance. And that, I think, is already a significant benefit because it just really streamlines all of those interactions that we have with the regulators and speeds things up as well in terms of their ability to be able to evaluate the information that we're transferring. We also have controlled terminologies, and these are really, really important because it tells us how to classify data. One thing that is important to note, though, it doesn't tell us what to collect, and it shouldn't. And I think that that's a really important consideration. There's also a standard to define protocol design parameters, which initially came out of Transcelerate, but then was ratified by CDISC, which I think is also a really interesting standard because it allows us to standardize how we describe all of those design parameters and also share those design parameters with other clinical trial systems, but also things like clinicaltrials.gov or the UDRA registry within Europe. And I think there's a lot of mileage in that particular standard in the future. We also have standardization of data nomenclature and relationships for clinical data. So things like ODM, So it's the operational data model, which has been around for a long time and has evolved over the years. But what's really interesting about that standard is it tells us how to organize and how to label all of our clinical data. And it also provides us with a certain amount of flexibility. The other standard that I'm thinking about is E2BM, and the fact that we now have standard nomenclature for safety information as well. With these standards, we've also been able to increase trial efficiencies through the interoperability of clinical systems and clinical data sharing. So good examples of this would be, sharing data between EDC and pharmacovigilance systems for safety cases. And the ODM and the PRM standards are very focused on this. And then finally, all of these standards that we're talking about have the recognition of regulatory authorities and widespread use in the industry, and that I think is also extremely important. So I'm going to do a little poll now. I just want to sort of get a feel for how people in the room have actually implemented the TMF reference model itself. So Oliver, if you could bring up the poll, if you haven't already. So the question is, how did you implement the TMF reference model? And the first answer is, we implemented it as is with no customization. So you basically took the model and you configured your system with that model. You used exactly the same artifact names, exactly the same organization, the same artifact numbers, and you just went with it. Answer B is, we customized it to meet our specific requirements. And I know that some organizations do this. So sometimes the model just doesn't fit as is, and so they customize it to make it more relevant to what they're doing. And then finally, maybe some of you haven't implemented the reference model, so feel free to share that information as well.
So some interesting results. We'll give it a few seconds to keep coming in. We'll give you guys maybe another 10 or so seconds.
And Oliver, I don't actually see the results, so
I will read those out for you. No problem.
Great, perfect. I'm trying to multitask with my screens.
Yeah, exactly. We're a team here. So when it comes to, there are some folks who haven't implemented the TMF reference model. So that's interesting to see. We'll give everybody last few seconds to vote, and then I'll end. Okay, 3, 2, 1, done. So in terms of the results pool, so the most selected option is option B. So they implemented the TMF reference model but customized it to meet their specific requirements at 68.3%.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And then, but we still have 24.4% of the audience that implemented it at no customization, which is also fine. And then we've got option C, which is we have not implemented the TMF reference model at all. 7.3% of our audience have not implemented it yet. Yeah. So I guess, Paul, if you haven't implemented it yet, maybe there's a reason. Maybe you just haven't got around to it, or it hasn't been relevant for your organization. What would you do as a sort of recommendation for those folks that haven't yet implemented it but maybe want to learn a little bit more about it?
So totally get involved in the reference model meetings. It's a great community out there who have a lot of knowledge to share, and they're very happy to share it. I am interested though in the fact that almost 65% of the participants had to customize it, and I'm not surprised, because the reference model, as it says in the name, is a model. It was built that way so that people would take it and then they would use what they needed, and then they would adjust it to their needs, kind of thing. And that, I think, is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The only problem is that when it comes to data and using that information with systems, it does become very tricky, because obviously it's no longer standard, it's customized. But there are lots of good reasons why people do customize, and notably because there's so much variability when it comes to trial master file itself, and the content of the trial master file and what we're actually collecting. So I suppose this sort of highlights the fact that we do need to have a lot of flexibility, even if we did start to standardize things more. we need to think carefully about flexibility so that we can allow people to get the benefits of having a more formal standard whilst also making it practical to use. And I think that's definitely a challenge.
And do you think, Paul, that obviously with the updates to 3.2, the introduction of a whole range of sub-artifacts, do you still expect there to be a high level of customization to the reference model once people adopt 3.2, or is it just going to be that the reference model will continue to evolve and new artifact types will be added?
I think that I definitely think the addition of sub-artifacts is very valuable, but it also introduces a lot of additional challenges because we've got even more granularity to deal with. There's a lot of different document types now. I think we're probably close to about 900, which that's pretty significant. So I welcome sub-artifacts because I think in reality a lot of people were customizing the reference model because there weren't those sub-artifacts. But I do think that we just have to sort of be mindful that the more we add, the more complex it becomes.
Absolutely. And our friend Fran here is giving her own commentary in the chat as well, which is great. But we'll get to some of those comments at the end, Paul. I'll hand it back to you to continue.
Sure. So let's now talk a little bit about the reference model as a standard. And I asked myself the question, well, is it a standard? And I think it kind of is. When we look at the criteria that the BSI put out for establishing a standard, the first thing that they said, well, it's an agreed way of doing something, and I think for the most part, the TMF reference model does give us an agreed way of doing something. Most people, even if they're customizing it a little bit, are using the structures, the process zones, the sections. For the most part, they're using the artifact names. So it is an agreed way of doing something, but it's there is that customization and variability still. The distilled wisdom of people with expertise in their subject matter, absolutely, this is a huge thumbs up. I think that there's so much knowledge that's been distilled into the reference model, and that's why it's so successful. Makes our everyday lives easier. Again, big thumbs up. I'm pretty sure that without the reference model, things would be much more complex. And some of you on the call may remember how it used to be like before we had the reference model. And then finally provides a reliable basis for people to share the same expectations about a product or service. Again, because of the ability to customize, and not everybody implements it exactly the same way, it's not always going to be reliable to be able to share the content. Different people have different ways of interpreting the model. But all in all, I believe my opinion is that the reference model is a de facto standard. So it's not formal, but everyone treats it more or less as a standard. And then there's also the EMS. So some of you may be aware that we've developed this exchange mechanism standard, which is it's a subgroup of the reference model that put this in place. And it was really our first foray into developing a more formal standard for TMF content. And the goal of this standard was to establish a mechanism to exchange content, and also to provide a standard set of metadata. Now, this isn't a comprehensive set of metadata, but it's the minimum metadata that we felt we required to be able to transfer content from one organization and one system to another, and for that organization and system to be able to understand what they've received. Now, industry adoption so far has been slow, and I think that there are lots and lots of different reasons for this, and I'm not going to get into that today. But the main thing is that there still is very much interest in getting it off the ground, and we're slowly starting to see that adoption. And I'm hoping that we're gonna see a snowball effect, as more and more organizations start to request transfers in this format, in this standard, and as more and more systems become capable of either generating or receiving exchange files, we'll get the adoption. And I think that there's a lot of potential with this to solve a lot of the issues that we currently experience in the industry around interoperability. And I think it's definitely a big area that we need to work on as an industry. And I think finally, this definitely would benefit from more formality, even just as a substandard of the reference model. So what would be the benefits if the reference model became a formal standard? So if it became a standard that was governed by a standards organization, or even recognized by the regulators as a de jure standard. So I think that there are definite regulatory benefits. So if it became a formal standard, there may be greater recognition from the regulators, and that's not to say there isn't recognition. I think that the inspectors obviously see the reference model in use all the time as they're inspecting trial master files. But there are other initiatives underway, such as ICH E6 R3, where I think it would be nice if there was more consultation from regulators. If it became a de jure standard, it could be referenced from things like E6 potentially. And it would be referenced really as a standard that would be used to organize, name, and index TMF artifacts. Having a formal standard to identify the content could also facilitate remote regulatory inspections, because obviously we're seeing that more and more today with COVID. But I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's starting to become a normal setup where inspectors are asking for remote access to information. And so I think that it could facilitate this, especially if we look at things like ECTD, E2BM, and STTM. They're used to facilitate the exchange of information with regulators. So why not something like EMS? The other set of benefits is around interoperability, of course. That's really one of the big focuses of standards. So without formal standards, which is kind of what we have today, typically we'll have a bunch of different systems, source systems, or source information or repositories that we need to manually map and upload into the sponsor eTMF at some point, because obviously the sponsor is the guardian of the trial master file, and they're the ones that are responsible for maintaining it and retaining it through the 25-year retention period. Now, this is a very time-consuming and costly exercise, all of this manual mapping and manual uploading of content, and I think a lot of sponsors actually have challenges with this. This is kind of made more complex because obviously there's a lot of custom implementations or interpretation of the reference model. It also means that we can really only do sort of infrequent transfers. We can't do real-time or sort of daily or hourly transfers of content because there's a lot of human interaction that's required. It also results in a lot of indexing errors. We spend a lot of time fixing sort of indexing errors when we're doing all of this mapping. There's also little standardization of metadata. So most organizations have their own standards for metadata. And so we have to do a lot of mapping between those standards. It also creates a lot of challenges when it comes to oversight and metrics. So just trying to sort of calculate, for example, completeness, when you have all of this decentralized information in different systems in different organizations, not so easy. And also oversight, of course, being able to access information to evaluate what's going on in the study, not so simple. So we end up really with a disconnected eTMF in multiple systems in this scenario. Now, if we think about formal standards, where we're actually formalizing the way that we index and organize TMF content, obviously we have much better interoperability. So we have standards-based interoperability, which allows us to reduce the time and the cost of migrating information or transferring or exchanging information between those source systems and organizations and the sponsor TMF, because those source systems are not going to go away. Remember that the scope it's not just about the eTMF, it's also about all of the other systems that we're using in clinical trials. So the big advantages here are obviously we have automated transfers of artifacts, metadata, and audit information because everybody's using the same standard to describe this information. And so it's a lot easier to be able to automate that and potentially have it in near real time. Obviously, there needs to be procedural controls around that. There's a lot of reduced mapping errors through standardized indexing. So we're no longer having to do a lot of mapping, if maybe wouldn't even have to do any mapping at all to be able to achieve this. We also have much better real-time oversight and more comprehensive and more accurate metrics because we have all of the information in one place. And it's also possible to integrate and align with other formal clinical trial standards. So if we think about some of the other systems out there that are using formal standards, quite often we need information from those systems. And so if we were using a formal standard, it's easier to then integrate into those other standards. And then also finally, we have this vision of being able to have a holistic sponsor eTMF with all artifacts in one place. Now that it may seem a little utopian probably today. We're not there yet, but I think it's something that we're striving towards. And I think that standards is part of that journey of getting there. It's not the only thing, but it's part of it. And then finally, the operational benefits. So, standardization of TMF information would allow us to start to break down some of the barriers that we currently have, by outsourcing clinical trial activities, and then also having all of those disconnected systems. And as more and more systems and organizations start to adopt standards and potentially a TMF standard, obviously oversight will become a lot simpler and improve. And then finally, we'll be able to spend less time on migration and re-indexing content and actually leverage the TMF to gain better operational insight into the study, really sort of mine that gold mine of information that we have. So then I just want to sort of finish up here on the idea of having an eTMF standard, and what could we standardize and what shouldn't we, or what can't we standardize. And I think the most important thing that we can't standardize is the content of the TMF. We can't really standardize exactly what should be collected to meet regulatory requirements, because there's just way too much variability in the content that we collect. And as we know, the regulations themselves are not necessarily 100% sort of black and white when it comes to what's required in the TMF. There's a lot of gray areas, and so anything that's gray is very difficult to encapsulate in a standard. So I don't think we can have a standard to define exactly what needs to be collected, but I do feel that we could have a standard for the structure of the TMF, so process zones, sections, artifacts, and we kind of already have that with our de facto standard, which is the TMF reference model. Another area that I think is ripe for standardization is metadata. We're more and more we're leveraging metadata. We're using metadata. It's becoming easier to extract metadata through things like AI and machine learning. It would be great if we could standardize the nomenclature of that metadata. Audit trail and activity log / history. In the EMS, we've already established a standard for audit trail, but I think activity log and history is a really important one, because more and more the regulators are looking at activity logs. They want to understand who did what, how did we get here, and so having standards around logging of information and describing who's doing what, I think could be really useful. Electronic signature manifestations, again, we already have a standard defined in the EMS for those things, for electronic signatures, so who signed what, when, and for what reason. Other records management information. So this is pure sort of, when was a record created, who modified it, who accessed it, that kind of stuff. We already have standards that exist outside of clinical trials for this, which we could adopt. Standard process or event information. This one I think is a really interesting one for the future. So trying to establish standard processes within clinical trials, standard events that occur, and then maybe defining, well, what kind of information should we be organizing around those things, and then finally milestones. So having standard milestones, and again, we've already done some initial work on this within the reference model, but I think it definitely could go much further. So those are the things that I think that if we were to start to think about standardizing, those would be really good candidates. And so finally, the future of eTMF, a lot of stuff's happening. A lot of new things are starting to appear on the horizon in terms of how we organize and manage trial master file, and then also what kind of tools we're starting to get now to make that process easier, and also to be able to generate more value from our TMF. And I believe strongly that there's a really great opportunity to maybe establish a standard clinical process model, which enables us to better cluster information. I think today the way that we organize information is not necessarily contextual, it's not interconnected, it's not easy to reconstruct things from all of these disparate documents that we're storing in various different places within our TMF. I think if we could pull them together around a standard set of processes, it would be really, really helpful, not only for inspections, but also for operational teams. I think there's also an opportunity to develop a standard event messaging, which basically will allow us to communicate events that are happening. So for example, if a subject has a serious adverse event, well, we could communicate that as an event, and we know that there's a whole bunch of things that then need to happen based on that event. Or it could be that an ethics committee has approved a protocol amendment in a particular country. Well, that's an event that's occurred in the study, and the idea here is that we can not only improve interoperability between systems that are managing the information for these events, but also it would help us in generating placeholders within our TMF, because we know that we're going to need to have content, information in our TMF based on an event that's occurred. It would also improve oversight, and then finally, we can even think about things like risk management and taking a more proactive risk-based approach to managing our studies and managing our TMF. One thing that we're also thinking about within the EMS group is as we move away from documents and move towards data, having the ability to use the EMS to handle data-only records. And again, this could be from one TMF system to another, or from other systems. And then finally, aligning with other clinical standards to facilitate exchange and inspection of TMF relevant information that may be held in other systems outside of the eTMF. So I think that all of these things will be greatly facilitated through standardization. And with that, I'm going to now open it up for some questions.
Amazing, thank you, Paul. If you wouldn't mind just stopping the share on your screen, and I'll jump into my deck very, very quickly. Thank you for that. Well, first of all, thank you, Paul, for taking us through such an insightful presentation. Lots of really great content there as it relates to standardization. There's quite a few questions that came in, and so I'll fire a couple at you, and I have a couple myself for you. So the first question I have, you talked a lot, Paul, about sort of the reference model, and is it a standard, is it not a standard, and if it is, what kind of standard it is. And you talked about the de jure standard and how it's sort of maybe moving closer towards ECTD. What do you think the reference model needs to do? How do you think that needs to evolve for the reference model to become maybe more of a de jure standard?
Well, I think first of all, there obviously needs to be a confirmed need for it to become a de jure standard, because obviously a lot of people are using the reference model today, and it may be fine that we just leave it like that, and it may be also complex to make it into a de jure standard. I think is something that needs to be properly thought out. At the same time, I think that if it did become a de jure standard for describing and organizing TMF content, not defining what needs to be collected, then I think that there definitely would be maybe more of an audience when it comes to the regulators.
And I guess maybe on that line, potentially aligning with a standards organization as well.
Potentially, yeah. I think that there's a lot of different possibilities, and I think that at the moment, what's important is we need to first of all establish, well, what needs to be standardized, and then sort of decide on how best to govern it.
Okay, perfect. I had a question here relating to the exchange mechanism standard. So the question is the exchange mechanism standard too complex for non-technical folks? And are there maybe any recommendations for people that are non-techie to kind of get an understanding of how they could potentially use it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When we first started working on the exchange mechanism standard, we sort of said to ourselves, well, we need to establish a standard that can be understood both by machines as well as by humans, and that's actually quite a tall order. It's not so simple. Having sort of worked now for the last 3 years on the exchange mechanism and had lots of different discussions with the different stakeholders, because in my mind, there are 3 primary stakeholders. There's the vendors who develop the systems, there are the CROs, and there are the sponsors. I believe for it to be successful, it's important that all 3 of those groups get together. You're right, there are some aspects in relation to, well, how do I leverage this to get one system to speak to another, which is quite technical, but I think that we should leave that to the vendors, because they're the ones that are ultimately developing the systems. But when it comes to the actual metadata and the things that we're describing with the exchange mechanism, obviously in the specification we describe what all of these things mean, and a lot of them are quite straightforward. So like country or site name, site number, those kinds of things, most people can understand those, and especially if you read the specification, it gives you a full description. But I think the technical implementation requires all 3 parties to come together with a will to implement this thing. And the business needs to own it, but also the vendors need to get involved to do the technical implementation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one last question. What would be the biggest challenge in standardization of the TMF reference model? I know you touched on this a little bit, but what do you think? I guess maybe this question is coming from the user of the reference model.
Yeah.
So
I think the biggest challenge is building in flexibility, because of the nature of the TMF and the variability of the TMF. If we decided that we were going to establish a standard but that was too rigid, a lot of people would probably not use it because they just wouldn't be able to use it because it's not flexible enough for their environment. And so I think that that's a really key thing to consider. And I know in other standards, so for example in the CDISC standards, when it comes to describing data sets, so using the ODM standard, they have like standard metadata for all of the different data points that we typically see in a CRF, but they also have a mechanism for you to be able to define your own data points, but in a very standard way that would be understood by everybody. So I think that there are definite parallels that we can draw with what CDISC did and how they approached it, and I'm sure that other standards organizations also did something similar. And I know that within the EMS group, we've already started to think about how can we build in flexibility to be able to adopt a much broader set of standard metadata, but also give organizations the ability to have their own metadata that's not standard, but can still be encapsulated within the EMS.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. So for that, there are some other questions. We will get it, sort of an export of the questions afterwards to go through that process. What I will just finish on is just a highlight of what's coming next. So the last session of today is a really great panel. Honestly, I'm really, really excited for this one. We're going to be talking about all of the updates to ICH, GCP, E6R3. We've got a panel of experts that are going to talk about how quality by design will impact trial master files. We've got Dawn Nickham, who's the Senior Director of QA and Compliance at Inception, Barbara Novak from Kiowa Kirin, Judith Sahora from Agenis, and Jim Markley from Just in Time GCP. Really excited for this panel. So join us at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, so in roughly 40 minutes. We will be heading to the lounge. Paul and myself will be hanging out at the standardization table. If you guys want to come and chat, ask Paul some questions. Maybe even I can answer some questions, who knows? And join us for a discussion in the lounge area. That's live now. So we'll see you there. The networking break is for between now and the next session. So you've got 40 minutes to network with people. There's a number of different tables on a number of different subjects. So head over to that. With that, Paul, I want to thank you for not only preparing the content, but giving us your insight. Hugely informative, and really enjoyed the presentation. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and I'm glad that everybody found it useful. And see you hopefully in a few minutes in the networking area.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.